Mary and Peter were still grieving the loss of their son Michael. He'd been killed in a tragic accident, and ever since that day, their lives had never been the same. Every single day they visited his grave, it didn't matter if it was raining, freezing cold, or even unbearably hot. They always made the trip. It had become a part of their routine, a way to stay connected to the son they had lost far too soon. But about a month after Michael's funeral, something unusual started happening. Every time they arrived at the cemetery, someone had already been there before them. Sitting on top of Michael's grave was a fresh red rose. At first, they thought it was a coincidence. Maybe a stranger had mistaken the grave of someone else's. Maybe it was a random act of kindness, but the next day, there was another rose. Then another, and no matter how many times the flower wilted and died, a fresh one would appear in its place day after day, week after week, and the mystery only deepened. Who was leaving those roses, and more importantly, why? Peter eventually came up with a plan. He decided to place a hidden camera near Michael's grave. If someone was visiting every day, the camera would actually reveal exactly who they were. It seemed simple enough, but when Peter finally watched the footage, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Even then, he had no idea that the discovery would change everything. Peter and Mary were driving home after retrieving the footage from the cemetery. Their emotions were all over the place. Part of them felt excited, the other part felt terrified because after months of wondering who had been leaving the roses, they were finally about to get an answer. And yet, something about it didn't feel right. Nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to learn. Even after getting the footage, they couldn't bring themselves to watch it right away. They decided to wait until the next day. They needed time to think, time to prepare themselves for whatever was on that video. The next morning, they sat together and stared at the screen. A small pop-up appeared. The video file was ready. All they had to do was press play. One click, that's all that separated them from the answer that had been searching for. And only one click, that's all that separated them from the answer they had been waiting for a long time. Who was leaving red roses at their son's grave, and why had they chosen Michael? Questions had haunted them for months. Now they were finally about to find out. Mary and Peter had never truly recovered from Michael's death. He was only 18 years old when he was killed in a car accident. The tragedy shattered both of them. Since then, it had been just the two of them trying to navigate a life they never expected to live. Because as a parent, you're never supposed to outlive your child. That's not how life is supposed to work. Yet, that was the reality they woke up to every morning. After Michael died, it felt like they had almost lost everything. They spent nearly all of their savings on his funeral, but they never regretted it. Not for a second. Their son deserved a beautiful resting place, and they promised themselves they would continue looking after him even after he was gone. And what they didn't realize was that Michael's death was about to bring another chapter into their lives, one they never saw coming. Every day, Mary and Peter visited Michael's grave. They brought flowers, small keepsakes. Sometimes they would simply sit there and talk. They told him about their day, their shared memories, and for a little while it almost felt like he was still there with them and listening. The visits became a source of comfort, a routine they could rely on when everything else in their lives felt broken. Then one Monday morning, something caught their attention. As they approached Michael's grave, Mary suddenly slowed down. "There wasn't a flower here yesterday," she said. Peter looked closer and she was right. Resting neatly on top of that headstone was a single red rose, and neither of them had any idea where it came from or who had left it there. They looked around the cemetery expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. The grounds were quiet, almost completely empty. The couple checked the graves surrounding Michael's. Maybe someone was leaving flowers throughout the cemetery. Maybe this wasn't unusual, but after looking around, they discovered something strange. No one of the other graves had roses, and only Michael's. For some reason, someone had chosen him. At first, they brushed it off. Perhaps it was simply an act of kindness from a stranger, someone who felt sympathy for a young man who had died too soon. But then the same thing happened again and again and again. Every time the rose wilted, another fresh one appeared. It became impossible to ignore. Weeks turned into months, the mystery remained unsolved. And with every new flower, their curiosity grew stronger. Whoever was doing this seemed determined to stay anonymous, yet they never missed a day. Eventually, Mary and Peter began looking forward to seeing those roses. It had become part of their routine, a small mystery woven into their grief, but even though they appreciated the gesture, they still wanted answers. One evening, Peter came home with an idea. What if we put a camera near the grave? He asked. Mary immediately frowned, like, I'm pretty sure that's against cemetery policy, she replied. But Peter wasn't ready to let it go. The question had been bothering him for months, and he needed to know who was visiting his son's grave. And so one night, without telling Mary, he purchased a security camera and drove to the cemetery. The sky was completely dark. The rows of headstones seemed endless beneath the moonlight. Using a small flashlight, Peter carefully searched for the perfect hiding spot. Eventually, he found one. The camera had a clear view of Michael's grave, exactly what he needed. After making sure everything was working properly, Peter stepped back and admired his work. Now, all that was left to do was wait. When he returned home, he quietly climbed into bed beside Mary. She pretended to be asleep, but she knew exactly what he had done. She had figured it out the moment he left the house. The truth was, she was just as curious as he was. She wanted answers to, and she simply wasn't willing to admit it. Over the next 2 weeks, they continued their daily visits to the cemetery, and every time they arrived, Peter would casually glance toward the hidden camera, trying not to make it obvious. Mary noticed it every single time, but she kept her secret to herself. Then, just when they thought they were getting closer to the truth, something went wrong. On Tuesday morning, while they were getting ready to leave for the cemetery, the phone rang. Peter answered, and it was the cemetery manager. Someone had discovered the camera, a complaint had been filed, and because recording visitors without permission violated cemetery rules, the camera had been removed. For a moment, Peter felt his stomach drop. The entire plan had failed. But then the manager told him something unexpected. She had reviewed the footage, and before removing the camera, she had saved a copy she wanted them to have. Peter exchanged a look with Mary. Suddenly, the mystery felt closer than ever. After months of questions, they were finally about to get the answers. Later that afternoon, Mary and Peter drove to the cemetery, and the manager was already waiting for them. In her hand was a small USB drive, the very thing that might finally reveal the identity of the mysterious visitor. As she handed over, her expression seemed different, almost thoughtful, like she knew something they didn't. The three of them exchanged a few words about their families and how they had been doing. Then, just before leaving, the manager looked at the couple and quietly said, I thought you needed to see this. That was it. No explanation, no clues, just those 6 words. And somehow that made Mary and Peter even more nervous. The drive suddenly felt heavier than it should have, as if it were carrying something far bigger than a small video file. They took the USB home, but neither of them could bring themselves to watch it. Not yet, at least. The possibility of discovering the truth felt almost overwhelming. What had the manager seen? Why had she reacted that way? And what if the footage changed everything they thought they knew? Questions lingered in their minds throughout the evening. Eventually, they decided to wait until the morning, and neither of them slept particularly well that night. The next day, the USB drive was still sitting on that kitchen table, waiting. Neither of them said much during breakfast, and every few minutes, one of them would glance at the drive, then quickly look away. Finally, Mary broke the silence. What are we going to do, Peter? He didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed at the USB drive, as if he was trying to gather the courage to face whatever was inside. Does this really make sense? Mary asked softly. Peter took a deep breath, then he stood up. I need to know, he said. His voice was quiet but firm. If I don't find out, I don't think I'll ever move on. Mary looked at him for a moment, then nodded. We'll watch it together. Some of the tension seemed to leave Peter's shoulders. At least he wouldn't have to face it alone. A few minutes later, Mary brought her laptop to the kitchen table and she opened it and powered it on. Everything felt strangely normal, and yet neither of them could shake the feeling that their lives were about to change. They exchanged one last look, a silent acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Peter picked up the USB drive with one hand. With the other hand, he reached for Mary's. Their fingers intertwined. Then he carefully inserted the drive into the laptop. The screen flickered, a notification appeared. The file was ready. All they had to do now was press play. Peter's hand trembled as he moved on the cursor across the screen. His heart was pounding. He glanced at Mary one last time and she nodded. Ready. Or at least as ready as either of them could be. Peter clicked the button and the video began. At first, the camera showed a clear view of Michael's grave. Everything was quiet, still empty. Minute after minute passed, nothing happened. Mary began to wonder if the entire effort had been pointless, and had they spent months chasing a mystery that wasn't really there? Then, movement. Both of them leaned closer to the screen. A figure appeared near the edge of the frame. Someone dressed entirely in black. Slowly, the person approached Michael's grave. Neither Peter nor Mary could make out many details, but the figure kept their head lowered, their face hidden. The only thing that stood out was a single red rose clutched in one hand. The same type of rose that had been appearing on the grave for months. The visitor walked up to the headstone, then carefully placed the flower down. For a few moments, they simply stood there. Silent, motionless, as though paying their respects, as though speaking to Michael's in private. Peter and Mary stared at the screen, trying desperately to identify the person, but it wasn't easy. The visitor wore oversized sunglasses that obscured much of their face. The camera angle wasn't perfect. There wasn't enough detail. And yet, something about that person seemed familiar, very familiar. They replayed out the footage once, then once again, and each time they searched for clues, anything that might reveal the visitor's identity. Mary was convinced that it was a woman. Peter was not sure yet. But neither of them could ignore the strange feeling growing in the back of their minds. The more they watched, the stronger that feeling became, until finally they realized why. They recognized her, not immediately, not completely, but enough to know one thing. This was not a stranger, and the truth behind that realization was far more shocking than either of them had imagined. They stared at the screen in silence. Neither of them knew what to say. The woman in the footage looked familiar. Too familiar. Yet, that only raised more questions. And how could she be here? And why had she been secretly visiting Michael's grave for months? Peter replayed that footage again and again, and every time they watched it, the same feeling returned. They knew this woman, there was no doubt about it, but they hadn't seen her in years. More than a decade, in fact. The realization left them stunned. Mary couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of the woman lingered in her mind long after the video ended, but that night, she had made up her mind that she was not going to sleep until she found answers. There was clearly something they weren't understanding, something important. The only problem was figuring out how to confront the woman, and they had no idea when she visited the cemetery. No idea whether she followed the routine, and no way of knowing when she might return. Still, they knew they had to try. The next morning, they woke up early and drove straight to the cemetery. If the woman appeared again, they wanted to be there waiting. The last thing they wanted was to miss her. But when they arrived, they discovered someone was already there. The cemetery manager. She was standing near Michael's grave. The moment she saw them, she approached. So, she asked, "Did you watch the video?" Her curiosity was obvious. She had seen the footage herself and seemed eager to learn what Peter and Mary had discovered. But Peter and Mary had questions of their own. They asked the manager whether she knew anything about the woman. Unfortunately, she didn't. All she knew was that the visitor came by fairly often. Because of the camera, she had assumed Peter and Mary were trying to identify a complete stranger. What happened next caught her completely off guard. "We know who she is," Peter said. The manager blinked. "You do?" Peter nodded. "We just need to talk to her." The manager looked confused, and if they already knew the woman, why had they gone through all this trouble? Why install a camera? Why spend months trying to identify her? The situation suddenly felt more complicated than she had realized. And judging by Peter's expression, there was a lot more to say. The manager considered asking for more questions, but something told her it wasn't her place. This was clearly a private family matter, at least that's what she told herself. In reality, her curiosity was stronger than ever. So instead of leaving, she stayed. When Peter and Mary weren't looking, she quietly moved behind a nearby tree. From there, and she could keep an eye on the grave without being noticed. She knew she probably shouldn't be spying, but after everything that had happened, she couldn't help herself. She wanted to know the truth. Fortunately for her, she didn't have to wait very long. A short time later, a car pulled into the cemetery parking lot, and the manager immediately recognized it. She had seen the vehicle before many times. A rush of excitement ran through her. This had to be the woman. Meanwhile, Peter and Mary noticed the car as well. The moment the driver's door opened, both of them froze. A woman stepped out, and in her hand was a single red rose. The same red rose they had seen so many times before. Slowly, she began walking toward Michael's grave. Her head remained lowered, her movements calm and familiar, almost as if she had walked this path hundreds of times. She didn't seem nervous, she didn't seem afraid, she simply walked. Then she looked up and stopped. Peter and Mary were standing there waiting for her. The woman froze for a few seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched on. 3 people staring at one another. 3 people trying to process what was happening. Even the cemetery manager held her breath behind the tree. She had no idea what would happen next. Would they argue? Would they confront her? Would years of unanswered questions explode into anger? Then Peter took a step forward, slowly and carefully, and opened his arms. The woman stood motionless, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then finally, she stepped forward too and embraced him. And for a long moment, nobody said a word. The woman clung to Peter as years of emotion came rushing to the surface. Mary stepped forward next. Before long, all 3 of them were standing together crying. The cemetery manager watched from a distance, completely confused. This wasn't the confrontation she had expected. There was no anger, no shouting, no accusations, only relief, only emotions. And the more she watched, the more she realized she was missing a huge piece of the story. Eventually, she decided to approach them, and she felt slightly guilty for spying, but her curiosity had gotten the better of her. She walked over, and she couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious visitor really was, and why everyone seemed so emotional. Peter and Mary looked up surprised to see the manager still there. Neither of them had realized she had stayed behind. But before they could say anything, she asked the question that had been on her mind all morning. Who is she? The question hung in the air for a moment, then the woman answered. Her name was Noah, and she wasn't a stranger. She was an old family friend, and she certainly wasn't a random visitor. Noah was Mary and Peter's daughter. The manager was stunned, and everything suddenly became even more confusing. If Noah was their daughter, then why had they gone through all this effort to identify her? Why had she been secretly visiting Michael's grave, and why had nobody spoken to each other sooner? The answer was complicated. Years earlier, Noah had ran away from home as a teenager. She left and built a life of her own. As time passed, the distance between her and her parents only grew larger. Phone calls became less frequent, and they stopped altogether. Eventually, years went by without any real connection. The relationship had faded, not because they stopped caring about one another, but because life kept pulling them farther apart. Then Michael died, and everything changed. When Noah heard the news, she was devastated. She wanted to come home. She wanted to be there for her family, but fear held her back. After being gone for so many years, she wasn't sure how her parents would react. She didn't know if they would want her back in their lives. She didn't know if she would be welcomed, so instead of reaching out directly, she visited Michael's grave, alone, quietly, without telling anyone. Every time she came, she brought a single red rose. It was her way of honoring her brother, her way of grieving, and perhaps, without realizing it, her way of staying connected to the family she missed. When she attended Michael's funeral, she noticed that her parents didn't immediately recognize her. To Noah, that felt like confirmation of her fears. Too much time had passed. She assumed they no longer wanted their relationship with her, so she stayed away. But she never stopped visiting. She never stopped bringing roses, and she never stopped thinking about them. As Noah shared her story, tears filled Mary's eyes. Peter shook his head, and the idea that their daughter had spent all these years believing she wasn't welcome broke his heart. And nothing could have been further from the truth. They had missed her every single day. No matter what had happened in the past, she was still their daughter, and they still loved her. And for the first time in years, they finally had the chance to tell her that. Standing beside Michael's grave, the family shared memories, regrets, and emotion that had been buried far too long. The pain of losing Michael would never disappear, and the wound would always remain. But in the middle of that heartbreak, they found something they never expected. They found each other, and while they could never bring Michael back, they could honor him together. As a family, Mary, Peter, and Noah promised that nothing would come between them again. Too much time had already been lost. From that day forward, they would face life challenges together, and they would continue visiting Michael's grave, remembering the son and brother they had loved. The mystery of the red roses had finally been solved, but what they found was far more meaningful than they ever imagined. Because sometimes the answers we're searching for don't lead us to strangers. They lead us back to the people we thought we'd lost forever.